Just before the video begins, please subscribe and like the videos to help the channel grow. Thanks for watching.
You know, I really loved music, and I was able to like give out parts and stuff, you know, and I had an ear for harmony, and that's why I'm still alive today. They would have killed me on the spot, I'm sure.
By 1980, with the Mamas and the Papas now a distant memory, John Phillips was using his $150,000 a year royalty checks to fund his $1,000 a day drug habit. His royalties, as you can calculate, only made up less than $500 a day. For this reason, John had begun drug dealing to make up the rest. He awoke to a shot of cocaine, jumped in his white Cadillac, and his day began. John was down from 220 to 135 pounds. His hair was messy and shoulder length, and he'd grown a long beard. He wore shorts and either an open long sleeve shirt or jacket to cover the tracks on his arms. He carried his drug supplies in a black Gucci zip-up bag, and the bag was padlocked with a 3-digit code. While spending time with Keith Richards in London a year earlier, his heroin addiction had begun. The drug had took over him like fire takes over a burning building, and Richards felt guilty he'd introduced him to the substance. John, however, felt there was no one to blame but himself. He knew the dangers he was getting into. Chaos and John Phillips had always been best friends.
John becoming so addicted to drugs was very sad.
I had 12 Rolls Royces and a good art collection, and I slowly wasted all of it.
He'd attempted to get clean on returning to LA, but all he'd managed to do was find a pharmacy who supplied him with prescription drugs and fresh syringes. He sold what he got or traded it, whichever was appropriate. The steady relationship between John and the pharmacy worked well until one day it didn't. John sped over one morning as per usual in order to collect his bag of goodies, but as he turned the handle to the shop, the door wouldn't open. He looked in through the glass to see a familiar face, which he found quickly. He smiled excitedly, but that face wasn't as happy to see him. The man inside the shop held a note to the window which read, "Phone me," and with that John's smile disappeared. "Come on, boys, I didn't put any quarters in the meter," John protested, but the man inside the pharmacy ignored him. John stumbled along searching for a dime in his pocket. A sense of dread came over him and he felt weak. He eventually reached a phone box, almost getting hit by a taxi in the process, and began tapping the numbers with shaky hands. "What is all this phone me?" John snapped the second he heard a voice. "Come in again, but be very quiet," was the strange reply. John returned to the pharmacy to find the door now open. On entering, the pharmacist silently handed John a note. It read, "The DEA were here this morning. They have your picture and they want all our records by Monday morning." John was in shock. He looked up from the paper and mumbled, "I don't get it." In total confusion and in this state of shock, John needed his substances now more than ever. "I'm running low on things. I've got a..." John stammered. But before he could finish, the pharmacist blurted out, "No effing way. It's finished. Over. Don't come back. You can't come back, John, ever. It's over." The next few days, John went through withdrawals. He weaned himself down slowly from a doctor's prescription. It was painful. His hands shook. He was frightened to fall asleep, and when he did, he woke himself up shortly after. His wife was in a similar situation, but she checked herself into a hospital where she detoxed alone. They both managed to get sober, but it wasn't long before they were back to using again. A few weeks later, Mick Jagger arrived at John's house with his girlfriend. John had forgotten completely about the arranged visit, and his house was a shambles. Mick arrived in a limousine, but when he picked up on what was going on, he was shocked. John told Mick he was again withdrawing and planning to go cold turkey. "You can't just stop taking drugs like that. "You'll die," Mick said. "Why didn't you tell me? I could have bought you something to let yourself down easy." Mick had seen withdrawal before many times, and he knew the nightmare still ahead for John. In an attempt to help, Mick drove to a liquor store and bought cases of booze, rum, scotch, vodka. He'd warned John previous about heroin, but to no avail.
Mick's sort of the master of understatement, you know. I was in the kitchen at my house in England. I was cooking a spoon over the burner. Mick came in, and he said, "Don't you think you're getting a little deep into this?" And I said, "No, I can handle it." And he said, "Well, mate, I've heard people say that before." And he turned around and walked out.
Not long after, the DEA finally caught up with John, kicking in his door and arresting him in his bed. He'd been lying there all day high watching soap operas. The arrest embarrassed John deeply. This was not what he'd pictured when the mamas and the papas formed. While vacationing in the Virgin Islands, Cass Elliot began rehearsing with John Phillips, his wife Michelle, and Denny Doherty. John didn't take to Cass at first. She couldn't hit the notes he wanted, and her weight bothered him. Her obesity, he worried, would be an obstacle for the band's success. Doherty hadn't had this problem. John was desperate to add him to the lineup after hearing him sing.
When I heard Denny's voice, I knew that I had to have him. Denny just had this velvet, liquid voice, you know, that was insane to me. I mean, I sound like Bing Crosby.
By this point, John had already written California Dreamin', Monday Monday, and Go Where You Wanna Go. He had been reluctant to change his songwriting style. He'd fallen in love with folk music, and it was only after Cass and Doherty convinced him that he focused on pop. Rehearsals continued with Cass, but her voice was still too low for the harmonies John wanted. Then one day, walking through a building site, a lead pipe fell from a scaffolding and hit Cass on the head. She went straight to the hospital. The next time the band rehearsed, she could sing an octave higher. She was now an official member of the group. It was now 1965, and John was very well accustomed to acid. He could function reasonably well on it. If he dropped a tab and was driving, he turned the windscreen wipers on and watched them go back and forth. Though it wasn't raining, he watched psychedelically coloured rain smudge the glass. John had been playing around with lyrics. He'd penned down, "Don't get me mad, don't tell me lies, don't make me sad, just keep me high." He added a few more lines and Straight Shooter was complete. This time Michelle and Doherty were having an affair. John wrote the song I Saw Her Again in response.
I wrote that to punish Dennis. I saw her again last night.
Even more shocked than John that his wife was having an affair was Cass. She was madly in love with Doherty, and Michelle knew that. Cass saw it as the ultimate betrayal. She famously confronted Michelle saying, "You could have any man in the world, why do you have to take the one that I'm in love with?"
He was just God to her. When he had an affair with Michelle, it just really hurt Cass very, very badly, you know.
Cass's vocals at this point were so powerful, when she would let loose, the windows on the house would rattle. The group had moved at this point to Laurel Canyon in LA, according to Michelle, because it was a cheap place for struggling artists. After an audition, the group signed with Dunhill Records. John became consumed with their debut album. The vocals, the instrument tracks, everything had to be perfect if they were to succeed. Michelle and John were also growing apart. She wasn't at the studio much, and it never occurred to him to check Denny's room. No one wanted the couple's affair to compromise the group. They had just signed a 5-year contract, and the future was looking bright. The group had a strange divide. On one side Michelle and Denny, the other John and Cass. Cass felt insecure around Michelle, with her slim build and good looks. She didn't want to stand next to Michelle on stage. The contrast between the pair depressed her. On stage, Cass belted out the songs like her life depended on it. That was the one department Michelle would never outdo her. Cass sensed the tension between her and John. She could see this marking the end of the group. Michelle, in every way, was a problem to Cass. Go Where You Wanna Go was released as their first single. The song was tested in Hawaii. There was no interest. A few days later, there was a change of plan and California Dreamin' was released. The single slowly moved up the charts and the group's debut album, If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears, was released. Michelle and John were distant at this point. John felt frustrated. He couldn't convey the love and feelings he had for her in his words. He wrote the song Words of Love, which explained his emotions during this time. The lyrics read, "Worn out phrases and longing gazes won't get you where you want to go. Words of love, though soft and tender, won't win a girl's heart." At night, John sat in his pool at the Sunset Towers Hotel and gathered his thoughts. Through the early months of 1966, California Dreamin' became a massive hit. It could be heard everywhere: car radios, hippie vans, Beverly Hills boutiques. When they entered the stage for a concert at the Hollywood Bowl, the crowds went insane. Everyone loved the group, and despite John's fears Cass would put off the audience, she seemed to represent everything the group was about, a symbol of free spirit and confidence. The band embodied the hippie movement. Following their newfound wealth, Cass bought a Porsche, but when she couldn't fit inside, she swapped it for an Aston Martin. Their next single, Monday Monday, hit number 1 just a few weeks after its release. By this point, Michelle and Dennis' fling had ended, and she was now seeing Gene Clark of the Byrds. Gene attended a concert one day, and John felt like swinging his guitar at Gene's head from the stage. John stormed off stage, threatening to throw Michelle out of the group. He was distraught. Whenever he heard Michelle's name, he dropped acid. Before their second album was to be recorded, John had finally had enough. He told the group he couldn't work with Michelle. Either he went or she went. That was an easy decision. Michelle was officially fired in a letter signed by all 3 members. Michelle turned to Cass for support, and Cass replied, "You can go leap off a building for all I care."
So actually Michelle was fired from the group, which was a dumb thing to do.
Touring stopped that summer and cost the band hundreds of thousands, but the royalties kept coming in, along with the advance for the second album, so the group were far from skint. John listened endlessly to the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album. It inspired him to work on the Mamas and the Papas' second album. He didn't want the group to be seen as just another flash in the pan. I Saw Her Again was released as the group's third single. It was disappointing, doing nowhere near the numbers of Monday Monday. Jill Gibson was hired to replace Michelle. She couldn't sing as well, didn't look as good, and just didn't suit the group. Michelle did everything she could to be reinstated in the band. Michelle rejoined the group not long afterwards. Along with the group, Michelle and John's relationship was also reconciled. By now, the Mamas and the Papas had released their second album, with 2 more singles, Look Through My Window and Dancing in the Street. John and Michelle were now inseparable, and Cass became pregnant. Royalty checks came in constantly. 10 grand here, 50 grand there. John used his wealth to buy a mansion in Bel Air. He bought telescopes and paintings, spent thousands of dollars on clothes, and walked around the house in Indian robes and sandals. The rest of the group wore expensive hippie clothing. Hippies loved the band, and they played to their audience.
Well, we'd like to sing a medley of the tunes that are partially responsible for our enormous wealth.
Tomorrow was never considered. It was the here and now which was important. The Monterey Pop Festival was planned in 7 weeks by John. It was to be a free charity event with no groups being paid. The Mamas and the Papas were to close the festival. Scott McKenzie was to perform, and John wrote him the song San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair. The song was credited for bringing thousands of young people to San Francisco during the mid to late 60s. Following Monterey, the group's royalties doubled from 5 to 10%. Their next single, Creaky Alley, told the story of the group's beginnings. The song was infectious and memorable for the chorus, "No one's getting fat but Mama Cass." After their next album, Cass quit the band when she had an argument with John. Cass felt very lonely and hangers-on followed her. In essence, she bought her friends. John publicly announced that the band had broken up, citing they were just going through the motions and felt phony. John and Michelle's daughter, who was conceived at the Monterey Pop Festival, was born in February 1968. Michelle relished in motherhood, but their marriage was crumbling as fast as the group. They were both having affairs at this point. The single "Dream a Little Dream of Me" was released shortly afterwards. The record company even released it by Mama Cass. Cass had hated the song at first, but John convinced her it would be a big hit. She would go on to have a very successful solo career, albeit tragically cut short. Michelle and John's marriage ended not long before the 60s did. She took their daughter and left. For the rest of John's life, he would be in and out of friendships with Michelle, sometimes not talking for years. To combat the loss of his marriage and his band, John partied harder. Being in LA in the 60s, John knew about the cult leader Charles Manson. One time from Dennis Wilson and one time from a friend who told him, "This guy tries to steal your soul. He sucks it through your eyes while you're tripping." When the Manson murders occurred, Roman Polanski suspected John was responsible. He checked John's car for bloodstains and was suspicious when he saw a machete on the back seat. Roman had been involved with Michelle previously and had been warned by John, "Stay away from other guys' wives, otherwise you'll be seriously injured." He had it in his head this could be revenge. One day at a dinner party, Roman held a meat cleaver to John's neck and quizzed him on Sharon Tate's murder. John denied the allegations and stated, "If you don't take that thing off my neck, we're going to have a major problem here." That ended Roman's suspicions. John's first solo album, John Phillips' Wolf King of LA, was released in 1970. The album did well critically but not commercially. Denny stated, "Had the Mamas and the Papas performed this album, it would have been one of their finest." As the Mamas and the Papas were still contracted to release another album, People Like Us began in 1971. The album produced some classic songs, but the band had now been apart for as long as they'd been together. Cass at this point had a full-time nurse assigned to watch her. The nurse earned herself a credit on the album for medical aid. Michelle later wrote in the liner notes of a Mamas and Papas CD compilation, "The album sounded like what it was, four people trying to avoid a lawsuit." Meanwhile, Cass married in 1971. After she went into therapy, she realised she'd made a mistake and the couple divorced a year later. She was on and off prescription drugs and fasting a lot. She had to cancel shows from fainting spells, and one night she went to sleep and didn't wake up. Her heart had simply given out. She was 33 years old. John was devastated. He broke down at the funeral.
I was just so proud of her and happy for her. And then just went so quickly. I just cracked. I broke into, hysterics almost. I pounded on the casket, I miss her very much.
During the 70s, John worked on his third wife's album, Romance is on the Rise. The pair worked on a musical called Man on the Moon. The reviews were abysmal. Phillips moved to London in 1973, where Mick Jagger encouraged him to work on a solo album. He quickly became addicted to heroin, and the album was aborted. In 1980, John's wife gave birth to another daughter of his while he was stoned out his mind on the couch. He entered rehab after his arrest, spoken about at the start of this documentary.
I guess if I hadn't been arrested in 1980, we wouldn't be here today talking, because I was really on my final legs. I was just a mess,
When he entered rehab, he was in such a bad state, the staff doubted whether he could walk to the cafeteria to eat. He looked like he belonged in a casket, said his elder sister. After he sobered up, he became a drug counsellor and helped reduce his prison time by doing an anti-drug media campaign. Clean from drugs, John began thinking about the mamas and the papas again. He contacted Denny, who was drinking heavily at the time. John formed the new Mamas and the Papas with his daughter Mackenzie Phillips, Spanky McFarlane and Denny Doherty. Although John had quit drugs, he was drinking heavily and quickly sank into alcoholism. In 1982, the new Mamas and the Papas began touring. Different incarnations of the group would continue until John's death. A year later, John wrote a song with Scott McKenzie called Kokomo. It would later be a big hit for the Beach Boys. In 1992, John's liver finally failed. He brought his family back together, seeing how ill he was. After receiving a transplant, John continued to drink. In 2001, John Phillips died of heart failure. He was also in the advanced stages of liver cirrhosis. Michelle Phillips went to see him on his deathbed. She told him he had made her what she was. He smiled before falling unconscious. John Phillips' music radiated love, intelligence, wit, and vulnerability. These songs are the greatest gift left by the free-spirited outsider they called Papa John.